Let's get further into the skeletal muscle and generation force relationship. So there are a number of these relationships that are presented from a muscular contraction and force development process. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but we're going to begin by talking a little bit more from a structural component or perspective and how skeletal muscle during contraction generates force, right? So the mechanics of force production via muscle contraction is truly oriented around this concept of the sarcomere and the sarcomere contracting and creating a muscle contraction or shortening. And it's at this myofibril level or the of the individual muscle cells, and within the muscle cells you have the sarcomere from Z disc to Z disc, and there's some structural anatomy we'll go over in a second, but it makes up the entire muscle. So here we show the number of steps that lead to the formation of the electrical signal that initiates the concentric contractions. And as you can follow, it leads these to 1, 2, 3, 4 during contraction, and it goes back to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and that is what happens for the relaxation phase. This is a very gross and superficial analysis and integration. So if you want to know more about it, you can definitely have some more investigations into it. But to begin the series of events at the synaptic terminal, so if you see this, here you have the nerve cell coming in at the synaptic terminal. Here we call this the synaptic cleft, and then you have going into the skeletal muscle there on the bottom. So ACH is acetyl coenzyme 8, and acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is released into the synaptic cleft, binding to the receptors, and then it travels to within these T tubules that travel on down. The T tubules are where the action potential is traveling and generated, reaching the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And once into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the calcium ions are released, and this is truly where you see a generation of the skeletal muscle. But the calcium causes an opening of the myosin head and the binding sites for the trypomyosin by attaching to the troponin, which is a twisting mechanism, and you can see it coming around on this down here. But these are some troponin, and what happens is these twist and open up the sites that create locations for the myosin heads to bind to the actin. So through that binding of the calcium, it creates that ability for the strong bind of the myosin and actin to create the power stroke. And if you down here, you see, so you have the thick and thin filaments. The myosin are the thick, the actin are the thin. And so what happens is as they myosin come down and attach the actin, they pull them closer together, the Z discs, and you become a shortening or a concentric contraction of the skeletal muscle. And then you have the removal of the acetylcholine, and it uptakes the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then it unbinds, and so it causes the contraction to end by the relaxation of the myosin. Now, one side note is what you don't really see here is there's actually a general binding of the myosin and actin, but it's not a very hardcore and permanent binding that causes the contraction. So with the binding of the calcium, it creates that strong bind of the myosin and actin. This is just another depiction that further illustrate the binding sites on the troponin. And so you can see that here in A, you have the troponin coming around, and then the trypomyosin there. So you can see down on B, on the very bottom here, you can see the interaction of the binding site with the calcium and the troponin, and where you see the myosin heads attaching. So another depiction of the cross-bit cycling and how it looks. If you take it, you can see how it goes in clockwise, starting at 1, coming around the circle. But this is that little loose binding that I talked about in the last slide of where the myosin head comes up and has a loose binding to the actin already. But what happens is there is the introduction of ATP, a releasing of the myosin head detaching from the binding site. And then the ATP is hydrolyzed into ADP plus a phosphate ion. And then you have the binding now, the firm binding of the myosin to the actin. And it's creating with the release of the phosphate ion, the power stroke. And the power stroke shifts the actin. And as you saw on the last slide too, where you had the actin coming into each other, it's this power stroke that generates that force and generates the sliding. And that is the sliding filament theory and how it happens. And sometimes the debate is whether or not one power stroke occurs and then it releases in strokes again. And so the sliding filament theory, interesting to note, is generally a theory right now. It hasn't been completely proven. There are a couple other concepts of how this occurs, whether it's just a cocking and continual restroking, or if it is a complete power stroke, a release, and then generate again all the way up. So whether it's just a idea where the myosin continues to jump from one actin to the other, or you have this complete stroke and then it attaches over here. But again, it needs the presence of two things for this to occur, and that is the ability or the presence of ATP, but also the ability of the calcium in order to produce the cross-bridge cycling that produces skeletal muscle contraction. And so it is actually that sliding of the thick, which is the myosin, and the thin filaments over each other that generates the force that is transferred to the cytoskeleton or the skeletal muscle. To go forward, and as we look back with the cross-bridging, the idea of force production and the ability to produce force with these cross bridges is the idea of how many of the myosin heads are interacting with the actin, right? So there is a relationship with the number of cross bridges to the magnitude of the force production at the skeletal muscle concept or the myofibril level. So what we have here is this idea of a force velocity relationship. And first of all, let me orient you with this graph and understand. So the y-axis is right here in the middle. And again, that is force production. And the x-axis is down here, and that's velocity. So this intersection here is the 0, 0, where there is zero force production and zero velocity. And so as we read this, what we're going to look at is the first important concept is the isometric force. And it's important to understand that isometric force is there's no change in the muscle length. And that is what's happening at the isometric concept. You're generating force, and so that means that you have the myosin head interacting with the actin, but there's no shortening of the sarcomere. And so what happens is if I push against the wall or try to move something in an isometric hold, I'm going to be having the maximum number of these myosin actin cross bridges, which is going to increase the magnitude of force. So from the concept of a concentric contraction, the greatest amount of force, the greatest amount of force production within a myofibril muscle happens at this isometric level, okay? And to take this further, as we go in this graph, we move to the right or to the left, you'll see that there's an increasing velocity. So that means that you're increasing the concentric going to the right, and lengthening is eccentric muscle action. So as the velocity increases, so that means how quickly the shortening or lengthening of the skeletal muscle and sarcomere is happening. What is the force being produced? And so if you can think about that, if we just talked about from the isometric concentric or isometric contraction, and we said that there's the maximum number of interaction between myosin and actin. Well, if I increase the velocity, that means fewer and fewer of these actin and myosin are going to be interacting with each other, generating force. Now, if we look at this on the right-hand side, you see how as we increase our concentric muscle action and the velocity of that, we see a decreasing of the skeletal muscle force. And so that is very important for you to understand this force-velocity relationship. Increased concentric muscle action velocity decreases the amount of force generation because it allows for less time for summation of the myosin actin cross bridges together. Now, there's another component of this that's very important to understand, and this is where we don't really have a true answer. We have some theories behind what's going on, and I'll demonstrate a model for you shortly here. But it's what's happening on the left-hand side of this, and that is during the eccentric muscle contraction. You'll see that during the eccentric muscle contraction, we have an increase in force generation. Now, one thing I want you to know, there's some other message. Now, eccentrically, you're not concentrically creating the myosin actin cross bridges. What's happening is there's some other components that go into play here. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. But what we don't see is this very exaggerated. It looks more like this. And this is actual data collection. So over here, I'll call that A, and over here B. You'll see that during the isometric area, there's a slight, and during a short velocity in the eccentric, there is a great increase, but it kind of plateaus. So understand that in the theoretical drawing, it has equal to what's going on with the concentric, but that doesn't really happen generally. And sometimes you'll actually see it drawn out like this, where it plateaus and it comes down depending on the velocity. And keep in mind, this one only goes to negative 20% velocity. So understand that as a force velocity relationship, isometric is the greatest that you can increase your force production from the concentric components. As we increase our muscle velocity, contraction velocity, in the concentric, you have a decrease in force production, but there's a slight increase in force production eccentrically as velocity increases, and we'll talk about what that is for here in a second. Next component is length tension, and so now we're going to talk about shortening or lengthening the sarcomere and what happens with the tension created. And so what we have here is, and this force on this y-axis is a percent of maximum, and that's the maximum is generally found when you do an isometric, because we talked previously about the greatest concentric force production occurs during an isometric, so that is essentially what happens. And so here you have the length of the sarcomere on the x-axis. As we go from the left to the right, you have an increasing. And again, so here, if you look at here, you have the concentric, so it's very shortened. This typically in the middle here would represent the isometric, when there is a muscle contraction occurring, but there's no shortening or lengthening. So we often call this L naught. So the length original of the sarcomere, and where you're just having, imagine that you have myosin and actin being generated and crossed here, but there's no shortening. And then you have the eccentric, or the elongation of the sarcomere here. So somewhere in the middle here is you have the L naught, or the original resting length of the sarcomere during the isometric contraction. And so this length tension relationship shows you how you can generate, and tension is just another word for force, or the pulling force on the skeletal muscle components. And so here is a theoretical depiction of what happens in a length tension. And here you have the L naught, or the original length. And again, you have the maximum amount of force production occurring at that length from the concentric components. And that's very important to understand as we go forward here, is this L naught in the maximum isometric or force tension ability is from the concentric components. As we concentrically contract to become the sarcomere shortens, it is producing a less amount of tension, or reduces the amount of force being able to produce. And that becomes what happens is you have an overlapping of the myosin and actin to a point where there will be some actin who do not have the ability to be contracted by myosin. So at the very head, a portion of it, some of them no longer can interact with the actin, the myosin head interact with the actin, so therefore you reduce the ability to generate force. But there's this component that happens, and again, to the right here now you have the eccentric component. So this graph is a little different than the muscle velocity or force velocity relationship, because this one going from on the right hand side, you have the eccentric component, because that, remember, that's the lengthening of the sarcomere, as you can see with this depiction here. Now, if we were just to follow the ability for it to generate contractile force. You can see how it reverts back to zero, very similarly to how it looks during the concentric contraction. And that, again, because as you can see, there's not much overlapping in this image here, and that reduces the number of myosin-actin interactions, because remember, the magnitude of force production from the concentric contraction component is related to the number of myosin and actin cross bridges that are generating the power stroke, creating this ability of force production. Now what happens though is you have this SEC and PEC tension created, and that is a series elastic and parallel elastic tension components of the skeleton muscle of the sarcomere, and there's two generally that are elastic components within the sarcomere, and that's nebulin and titin, and we'll talk a little bit in the next slide about where those come in. But what happens is, think about the sarcomeres being stretched this direction, and look at this spring coil. They've taken titin and they really create it as a spring concept. So if I pull both ends of the sarcomere out, as is with the eccentric contraction, you can see that this becomes like a spring-like, and it's storing tension. And that's why you see this increase here going up. So there is other components, and the parallel components happen because there's some fascia on the outside that also have some elastic components in there that also aid to the generation of force. So you see this blue line here on the bottom that goes up, and you see this curve, and that represents these elastic components that are being stretched and store some tension as you create this elastic component. And again, there's this magical window where it adds to this. But what happens is, now, if you can follow this line, total tension, it doesn't look and travel the same as that. That's because they've added the two lines together, and that is the tension that's created by the series elastic and that tension that's created by the contractile components, and so you get the total tension. So during, just like you did in the force velocity relationship, during eccentric contraction from a link tension relationship, there's an increase in force production, and it's generally related to the ability of these elastic components to store and return tension, store and return force, store and return energy, based off of them elongating and creating that ability to return it when the muscle no longer contracts. So one of the ideas and explanations for this, and one of the things I really want you to know, is that this is a theoretical model. And this is a mathematical theoretical model, and it's called the Hills model. And so you'll see this schematic of basically the model itself. Here you have the parallel elastic, and here's a series elastic. The CC represents contractile components. All these F's are the force tension that's created during the process. And so let me talk about a little bit of each of these components together. And so the contractile components of this are truly the actin and myosin, and these are that convert excitation into force in the contraction. So this is what we know is contractile or concentric contraction generated through the myosin and actin cross bridges. Then you have components that are known as paraelastic components, and these allow elongation and stretching of the muscle. And these are related to the fascial surroundings. So what you won't see is that the parallel is in parallel to the contractile component. So there's never a continuation of or in series with the contractile component. The parallel runs in parallel to the contractile components, or the actin and myosin, during the process of force generation. The final component of this model is the series elastic components. And these are the components that fall in line with the contractile components, and they transfer the muscle so the muscle force to the bone. And there are active and passive regions of this, as you can see with the titin and nebulin, and there's other tendons and ligaments that also act in this active passive. But what you'll see is that the series elastic, there's two different ways in the A and B depictions here. Series elastic can transfer the combination of the paraelastic and the contractile component forces, or it could just transfer the contractile component and meet up in the tendon of the parallel elastic force here. So remember that the Heels model is a mathematical theoretical model that determines and is meant to demonstrate why you have an increase in force or tension as the muscle elongates in an elastic component, and that's because you have the paraelastic and series elastic components. So now, taking in the idea of force production of the muscle into human movement, we have to understand that our previous discussions dealt with the myofibril and sarcomere levels, so a very small microscopic level of the skeletal muscle. And then each of those sarcomere and myofibrils add up to generate the force production and the line of pull of an entire muscle. And then you have instances like this where you have two muscles that are joining in their muscle pull to move the humerus in a certain direction. And to calculate the direction of that humerus and the line of muscle pull, or what we call the resultant of the force on the humerus from those two muscles, we have to do some geometry, and you would calculate, and I'm not going to walk you through the calculation because you don't really need to do that, but understanding that each of these muscles has its own line of pull represented by these vectors, and each one orients itself relative to its insertion. And so here you have the force of one muscle of the clavicle and one of the sternum. And those are the origins of each of these muscles. One is the origin on the clavicle, the other is the sternum right here, the pec. And so they both pull with a certain respect to the right horizontal. And again, these are in radians to make it calculations easier. So essentially what you're going to have to do is the creation and understanding how to work with vectors and just adding them together. So you have the first one going up, and then you add the second one coming down. And then you would do the law of sines and law of cosines. And here you have the orientation, understanding that counterclockwise is the positive direction of the rotation through the process. But understanding that to calculate this, you would add and create the two vectors coming together, and then you would do the law of sines and cosines to calculate the magnitude of the force of the total muscle on the pull of the humerus. So understanding that the net muscle force is you're going to oftentimes generate force production together, but you'll have to add the two vector components together to give you the resultant force of the pull on the humerus during the calculation.